6 years ago, she was pronounced dead, buried by the man who vowed to love her. Tonight, she's knocking on his door, alive and ready for answers. Hey, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, please subscribe for more shocking crime stories, and hit the bell icon. The darkest truth are yet to come. It was an unremarkable evening in the upscale neighborhood of San Bernardino, California. Grayson Hayes, a wealthy real estate developer known for his polished exterior and calculated demeanor, sat alone in his sprawling mansion. He swirled a glass of red wine, savoring its richness as soft jazz played faintly in the background. His second wife, Evelyn, was away on a weekend retreat, leaving him to enjoy the solitude he so often craved. But then came the knock, a sharp, deliberate sound that shattered the quiet like a gunshot. Grayson froze mid-sip, his brow furrowing. No one ever visited without notice. This house was his sanctuary, impenetrable by outsiders. Rising cautiously, he approached the door and peered through the peephole. What he saw made his blood run cold. Standing there was Lennox Hayes, his first wife, the woman who had vanished 6 years ago under mysterious circumstances. Presumed dead. Buried memories resurfaced instantly. She looked eerily composed. Her pink dress was immaculate, her hair styled with precision, but something about her presence felt off. As she tilted her head slightly, Grayson noticed faint bruises circling her wrists, evidence of trauma hidden beneath her poised facade. Before he could react, Lennox's lips curled into a chilling smile. "Hello, Grayson," she murmured softly, her voice slicing through the silence. "Did you miss me?" The question hung in the air, unanswered yet impossible to ignore. Grayson's heart pounded violently against his chest. Who, or what, was standing outside his door? The sight of Lennox triggered a flood of memories Grayson thought he'd buried long ago. Their marriage had once been the envy of their social circle, a dazzling blend of wealth, charm, and ambition. Lavish vacations, charity galas, and extravagant parties painted a picture-perfect life. But behind closed doors, cracks began to form. Lennox wasn't blind to Grayson's flaws. She uncovered his infidelity first, a fleeting affair with a young colleague, but it was his financial mismanagement that truly broke her trust. Grayson had been embezzling funds from clients, using their money to fuel his lavish lifestyle. When Lennox confronted him, accusing him of betrayal and deceit, arguments turned into shouting matches. One particularly heated exchange ended with Grayson hissing, "You won't live to regret this." Back in the present, Grayson stood frozen at the door, trembling as fragments of those dark days replayed in his mind. Hadn't he taken care of Lennox? Hadn't he ensured she disappeared forever? Yet here she was, alive and unsettlingly calm. How much did she remember? And why had she returned now? After what felt like an eternity, Grayson finally unlocked the door and swung it open. Lennox stepped inside without hesitation, her movements graceful yet deliberate. She glanced around the familiar yet altered space, taking note of every detail: the new furniture, the absence of family photos, the lingering scent of Evelyn's perfume. "Still living large, I see," she remarked casually, her tone laced with irony. Grayson struggled to find his voice. How are you alive?" he stammered, clutching the edge of the doorway for support. Lennox smiled faintly, her expression unreadable. "Oh, Grayson," she said, almost affectionately. "Let's just say I clawed my way out of hell, for you." Her words sent shivers down his spine. There was no fear in her eyes, only resolve. For a moment, Grayson wondered if she'd come back seeking closure or vengeance. Whatever her intentions, one thing was clear: Lennox's reappearance would unravel everything he'd worked so hard to protect. Lennox wasted no time getting to the point. Seated across from Grayson in the dimly lit living room, she began probing him with questions. "Tell me," she said coolly, "how have you been managing our finances since I've been gone?" Grayson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sweat beading on his forehead. "I don't know what you're talking about," he lied, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. Lennox leaned forward, her piercing gaze locking onto his. From her bag, she pulled out a crumpled receipt dated 6 years ago, the day she vanished. It was from a gas station in Albuquerque, New Mexico. "This should jog your memory," she said, sliding it toward him. Grayson stared at the receipt, his mind racing. That trip to Albuquerque had marked the beginning of the end. They'd argued fiercely in their vacation home over his embezzlement schemes. Things had escalated quickly after that. "I didn't do anything wrong," he protested weakly, but his trembling hands betrayed him. Lennox watched him intently, her lips curling into a knowing smirk. The weight of Lennox's questions pressed down on Grayson like a vice tightening around his chest. His mind raced back to that fateful trip to Albuquerque, the last time anyone, including himself, had seen Lennox alive. Or so he thought. They'd rented a luxurious vacation home nestled in the desert hills, far from prying eyes. It was supposed to be a romantic getaway, but their marriage had already begun to fracture under the strain of secrets and lies. Arguments erupted almost daily, each one more volatile than the last. The final confrontation stood out vividly in Grayson's memory. Lennox had confronted him with damning evidence of his financial crimes, accusing him of betrayal not just as a husband but as a partner in life. "You'll ruin everything," he'd shouted, his voice trembling with rage. And then, silence. Now, sitting across from her in his San Bernardino mansion, Grayson couldn't shake the feeling that Lennox remembered every word, every moment of tension between them. She leaned forward slightly, her piercing gaze never leaving his face. "You always underestimated me," she said softly, her tone laced with quiet menace. "But I'm not the same person I was back then." Her words sent a chill through him. Was this a threat? A warning? Whatever it was, Grayson knew one thing for certain. Lennox wasn't here by accident. Every question she asked, every detail she revealed, chipped away at the fragile shell of his carefully constructed reality. He clenched his fists tightly, trying to maintain composure, but inside he was unraveling. Lennox's calm demeanor masked a razor-sharp intellect and an unrelenting determination to dismantle Grayson piece by piece. She began weaving a web of psychological manipulation, planting seeds of doubt and fear in his mind. "Funny thing about Albuquerque," she mused, her lips curling into a faint smile as she leaned closer. "It has secrets buried deep in its deserts." Grayson froze, his heart pounding violently against his ribcage. Did she know about the grave? Had she uncovered the truth about what happened to her 6 years ago? Or was she merely guessing, testing his reactions to see how far she could push him? She continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You think you got away with murder, don't you?" The accusation hit him like a punch to the gut. Murder. The word echoed in his mind, dredging up memories he tried desperately to suppress. Panic surged within him, threatening to overwhelm his ability to think clearly. Was Lennox working alone, or had she enlisted help? Law enforcement? Private investigators? Someone else entirely? His paranoia spiraled out of control. If she knew the truth, how far would she go to expose him? And if she didn't, how long could he keep up the charade before she pieced it all together? Lennox watched him intently, savoring his discomfort. Her presence was suffocating, her words cutting deeper with each passing second. Grayson realized too late that this wasn't just a reunion, it was a reckoning. As Lennox's accusations mounted, Grayson's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. For years, he'd convinced himself that he'd gotten away with it, that no one would ever connect him to Lennox's disappearance. But now, faced with her unwavering stare and pointed questions, he felt the walls closing in. "Stop lying," he snapped suddenly, his voice cracking under the pressure. The outburst startled even himself, betraying the fear bubbling beneath the surface. Lennox smirked, unfazed by his desperate attempt to regain control. "You thought you were safe, didn't you?" she taunted, her tone dripping with mockery. "Thought no one would find me?" Her words struck a nerve, plunging Grayson deeper into panic. How much did she know? What evidence might she have gathered during her absence? Every scenario seemed plausible and equally terrifying. He glanced toward the door, half expecting authorities to burst in at any moment. But there was only Lennox, sitting calmly across from him, watching him unravel. She tilted her head slightly, studying him like a scientist observing an experiment. "Tell me, Grayson," she said, her voice soft yet menacing. How does it feel to know your past is finally catching up to you? Grayson opened his mouth to respond but found no words. His throat tightened, his palms slick with sweat. For the first time in 6 years, he felt truly vulnerable. Lennox had returned not just to confront him, but to destroy him. And worse still, she was succeeding. After Lennox's disappearance 6 years ago, Grayson Hayes had played the role of a grieving widower to perfection. He gave tearful interviews to local news outlets, hosted memorials attended by friends and colleagues, and even donated generously to charities in her name. To the world, he appeared devastated, a man who had lost his soulmate. But behind closed doors, Grayson moved swiftly to consolidate power. He drained their joint bank accounts, liquidated assets, and remarried within 2 years. His new wife, Evelyn, knew nothing of his past crimes or the woman who had once shared his life. For Grayson, it was a clean slate, a chance to rebuild without consequences. Now, sitting across from Lennox in his opulent living room, Grayson struggled to maintain his composure. Memories of his calculated deception clashed with the reality of her unexpected return. Lennox watched him closely, her calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside her. She leaned back slightly, crossing her legs as if settling in for a long conversation. "You really thought you could erase me," she said softly, her voice laced with quiet fury. Grayson clenched his fists tightly, sweat beading on his forehead. How much did she know? Could she prove anything? As the seconds ticked by, one thing became clear. Lennox wasn't here to forgive. She was here to destroy the illusion he'd worked so hard to create. Lennox began recounting fragments of her ordeal, each word dripping with raw emotion. Her voice trembled as she described waking up buried alive, suffocating under layers of dirt and debris. "I clawed my way out," she whispered, her hands trembling as she mimicked the motion. Every inch felt like an eternity. When she finally emerged, battered and broken, she collapsed on a deserted road. A passing driver discovered her and rushed her to a nearby hospital. But severe head injuries left her with amnesia. For years, she lived under the alias Mara, piecing together fragments of a life she couldn't fully remember. Recently, memories began resurfacing. Flashes of arguments, accusations, and ultimately, betrayal. With clarity came purpose. Lennox realized that Grayson hadn't just abandoned her. He tried to erase her entirely. Now, she was back, not for revenge, but for justice. Grayson listened in stunned silence, his mind racing. If Lennox remembered everything, what evidence might she have gathered during her recovery? And how far would she go to ensure he paid for his crimes? Her unwavering gaze pierced through him. "You took everything from me," she said coldly. "Now it's your turn to lose." Determined to expose Grayson's web of lies, Lennox reached out to local authorities. Detectives assigned to the case quickly uncovered glaring inconsistencies in his story. Why had he emptied their joint accounts shortly after her disappearance? Why were there no records of her leaving Albuquerque voluntarily? As investigators dug deeper, they unearthed connections between Grayson and several shady real estate deals. Forged documents, falsified signatures, and embezzled funds painted a damning picture of a man desperate to cover his tracks. Each discovery brought them closer to unraveling the truth about Lennox's disappearance and Grayson's role in it. Meanwhile, Grayson grew increasingly agitated. Phone calls from unknown numbers made him jump, and every knock at the door sent his heart racing. He tried to rationalize his actions, convincing himself that Lennox lacked concrete proof. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before the walls closed in. Lennox observed his growing paranoia with detached satisfaction. "The truth always comes out," she reminded him, "no matter how hard you try to bury it." Lennox dropped another bombshell. She'd found a key piece of evidence tying Grayson directly to her attempted murder. During her recovery, she'd undergone multiple surgeries to repair internal injuries caused by blunt force trauma. One procedure revealed a bullet fragment lodged near her spine. Ballistics tests confirmed it matched a gun registered to Grayson, a weapon reported stolen months before her disappearance. Grayson paled visibly, stumbling over his words as he tried to explain. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered, desperation creeping into his voice. Someone must have planted it. Lennox remained unfazed, her expression eerily calm. "Save it, Grayson," she said coolly. "The police are already on their way." His blood ran cold. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Panic set in as Grayson realized his carefully constructed alibi was crumbling faster than he could defend it. Lennox stood up slowly, brushing imaginary lint off her dress. "This ends tonight," she declared, her tone final. As the sirens drew nearer, Grayson's desperation reached a fever pitch. He paced the room frantically, running his hands through his hair as beads of sweat trickled down his temples. Lennox sat calmly on the couch, her poise unshaken despite the chaos unfolding around them. "Please," Grayson pleaded, his voice cracking. "I'll give you anything, money, property, whatever you want." Lennox raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "Money can't fix what you did," she replied sharply. "You stole my life, Grayson. No amount of wealth will change that." Her refusal ignited something primal in him. He lunged forward, grabbing her arms roughly. "You don't understand," he shouted, his grip tightening. "I had no choice. You wouldn't stop pushing me." Lennox didn't flinch. Instead, she stared him down, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Let go," she commanded firmly, "or I'll make sure they add assault to your charges." Grayson released her reluctantly, stepping back as realization dawned. There was no escape this time. A montage of flashbacks flooded Grayson's mind, each memory more damning than the last. Lies stacked upon lies, affairs concealed behind closed doors, financial schemes designed to line his pockets while draining their shared future. Lennox recounted these betrayals aloud, her voice steady but laced with pain. "You promised me loyalty," she said bitterly. "Instead, you gave me manipulation and deceit." Grayson flinched at her words, guilt overwhelming him. He remembered the countless times she'd confronted him, tears streaming down her face as she begged him to change. But instead of listening, he dismissed her concerns, gaslighting her into believing she was overreacting. Back in the present, Lennox's recollections struck a nerve. Grayson sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he muttered hoarsely. Lennox shook her head, her expression hardened. "Intentions don't matter," she said coldly. "Only actions do." Grayson snapped, his composure shattering completely. "You drove me to it," he screamed, his voice echoing through the room. "You wouldn't stop pushing me." Lennox remained eerily calm, her gaze unwavering. "No, Grayson," she corrected him softly. "This was all you." Her words hit him like a sledgehammer, forcing him to confront the monster he'd become. For years, he'd justified his actions, blaming others for his failures. But now, faced with undeniable proof of his crimes, he could no longer hide behind excuses. The sound of sirens grew deafening as police cars screeched to a halt outside. Officers burst through the door, weapons drawn. "Step away from her," one shouted, pointing a gun at Grayson. Lennox rose gracefully, brushing past him without a backward glance. As handcuffs clicked around Grayson's wrists, he met her gaze one final time. In her eyes, he saw neither hatred nor pity, only resolve. And then, the screen faded to black. The sound of boots stomping through the grand foyer signaled the end of Grayson Hayes' charade. Police officers swarmed his luxurious home, their movements swift and deliberate. Investigators combed every room, searching for evidence that would corroborate Lennox's claims. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. In Grayson's study, hidden behind a false wall panel, officers uncovered a treasure trove of incriminating documents, forged financial records, emails detailing embezzlement schemes, and even handwritten notes outlining plans to silence Lennox permanently. Among the items was a blood-stained scarf, later confirmed to belong to Lennox. Grayson stood handcuffed in the center of his living room, visibly shaken as an officer read him his rights. "You have the right to remain silent." The words felt surreal, almost distant, as if he were watching someone else's life unravel before his eyes. His meticulously crafted world, the wealth, the power, the respect, was crumbling into dust. Lennox watched silently from the sidelines, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression betrayed no emotion, but inside, she felt a flicker of relief. After 6 years of pain and uncertainty, justice was finally within reach. Sitting across from detectives in a sterile interrogation room, Lennox recounted her harrowing ordeal with chilling clarity. Her voice remained steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she described waking up buried alive, clawing through dirt and debris until she collapsed on a deserted road. "I remember the cold," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her, "and the suffocating darkness. I thought I was going to die." Her testimony painted Grayson as a calculating predator who had orchestrated her disappearance with ruthless precision. She detailed his escalating lies, financial manipulation, and violent outbursts leading up to the night she vanished. When asked about the bullet fragment found near her spine, Lennox revealed that Grayson had fired at her during one of their arguments, a claim supported by ballistic evidence linking the projectile to his gun. Detectives listened intently, jotting down notes as Lennox spoke. By the time she finished, there was no doubt in anyone's mind: Grayson Hayes was guilty. As she left the station, reporters swarmed her, shouting questions about her survival and pursuit of justice. Lennox ignored them, her focus unwavering. This wasn't about fame or vindication, it was about accountability. Investigators traveled to Albuquerque, New Mexico, following clues provided by Lennox. Using GPS data from her phone the night she disappeared and soil samples recovered from beneath her nails, they pinpointed a remote desert location where Grayson had buried her. The shallow grave was marked only by scattered rocks and patches of disturbed earth. As forensic teams began excavating, they unearthed fragments of fabric matching Lennox's clothing, along with traces of her DNA. A nearby shovel tested positive for both her blood and Grayson's fingerprints. The discovery sealed Grayson's fate. With physical evidence now corroborating Lennox's account, prosecutors built an ironclad case against him. Every detail, the bullet fragment, the forged documents, the shallow grave, pointed to premeditated murder. Back in San Bernardino, news of the excavation spread like wildfire. Friends and colleagues who had once admired Grayson struggled to reconcile his charming persona with the monster he'd become. For Lennox, however, the confirmation brought closure, not just for herself, but for anyone who had doubted her story. Alone in her apartment, Lennox sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. The whirlwind of arrests, investigations, and media attention had subsided, leaving her with a rare moment of quiet reflection. She thought about the years she'd spent recovering, waking up confused and broken, piecing together fragments of her identity, and ultimately confronting the man who had tried to destroy her. Had seeking justice healed her wounds? Or was she still trapped in the shadow of Grayson's betrayal? Lennox wasn't sure. Part of her felt lighter, as if shedding the weight of those lost years. But another part, a deeper, more primal part, knew that scars ran deep, especially when inflicted by someone you once loved. She thought about forgiveness, not as absolution for Grayson, but as a way to reclaim her own peace. Could she forgive him without excusing his actions? Or was this journey less about redemption and more about revenge, an act of reclaiming power stolen from her so violently? Lennox sighed, pressing a hand to her temple. Perhaps the answer lay somewhere between the two. What mattered most was that she had survived. And survival, she realized, was its own form of triumph. News of Grayson Hayes' arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Once celebrated as a pillar of success and philanthropy, he was now a pariah, a symbol of deceit and depravity. Friends and colleagues scrambled to distance themselves, offering hollow condolences while grappling with the truth about the man they thought they knew. "He seemed so kind," one neighbor remarked during an interview. "I never would have guessed." Social media exploded with theories and speculation, fueled by leaked details of Grayson's crimes. Photos of his lavish lifestyle juxtaposed against images of Lennox's recovery sparked outrage. How could someone so wealthy and powerful turn so cruel? For Lennox, the public reaction was bittersweet. While it validated her struggle, it also highlighted society's tendency to overlook red flags until tragedy struck. She avoided interviews, choosing instead to focus on rebuilding her life. One comment stood out among the noise. Lennox Hayes isn't just a victim, she's a survivor. Those words resonated deeply, reminding her that her story wasn't defined by Grayson's actions but by her resilience in overcoming them. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Grayson Hayes awaited sentencing. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit, his once immaculate appearance reduced to haggard disarray, he looked nothing like the confident real estate mogul who had dominated headlines for years. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, painting him as a remorseless killer driven by greed and ego. Witnesses testified to his manipulative behavior, while forensic experts confirmed the link between the bullet fragment and his gun. There was no room for doubt. When the judge delivered the verdict, life imprisonment without parole, Grayson slumped forward, defeated. Cameras flashed as officers led him away, his face obscured by tears and shame. Lennox watched silently from the gallery, her expression unreadable. She felt no joy, no satisfaction, only a profound sense of finality. This chapter of her life was over. Whatever emotions lingered, anger, sadness, relief, would fade in time. As Grayson disappeared through the courtroom doors, Lennox rose quietly, clutching her coat tightly around her shoulders. She didn't look back. Months later, Lennox stood alone in a quiet cemetery in Buffalo, New York. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling the sounds of the outside world. Before her stood a simple headstone bearing her name, a memorial erected by friends and family after her disappearance. She knelt down, brushing snow from the engraved letters. Placing a single red rose atop the stone, she whispered softly, "I'm still here." Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't born of sorrow. They were a testament to her strength, her refusal to be erased. Rising slowly, Lennox turned and walked away, her footsteps leaving faint impressions in the snow. The camera panned out, capturing the vast expanse of the cemetery as Lennox disappeared into the distance. The symbolism was clear. She was no longer defined by trauma or loss. She was a survivor, resilient and unbroken. As the screen faded to black, the narrator's voice echoed one final time. Justice may punish the guilty, but resilience redeems the soul. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Catch you in the next one.